The great hall of the eternal palace had not seen sunlight touch its sacred stones in 300 years. Heavy velvet curtains, thick with dust and age, blocked every window, creating a perpetual twilight that matched the somber mood of the kingdom. In the center of this shadowed chamber, upon a raised dais of black marble veined with silver, lay the body of King Theron, the last true Alpha King of the Northern Realms. His face remained unmarked by time, as beautiful and fierce as the day the curse took him. His dark hair spread across silk pillows that attendants changed weekly, despite knowing he would never wake. His chest rose and fell, with breath so shallow they seemed more habit than life, and his hands, crossed over his heart, had not moved in longer than anyone living could remember. The kingdom had learned to exist without him, had built new power structures and hierarchies in his absence, and most had forgotten that once, long ago, their king had been more than a legend, sleeping in darkness. Maya pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the service corridor, her heart hammering as she overheard the head housekeeper arguing with one of the council members. She had no business being this close to the royal wing, but curiosity and a strange pulling sensation in her chest had drawn her here, despite every instinct screaming at her to return to the safety of the kitchens. As an Omega, and a low-ranked one at that, she existed in the palace only because her labor was cheap, and her presence easily ignored. The conversation filtering through the partially open door made her blood run cold with a mixture of fear and inexplicable anticipation. The council had decided to perform the awakening ritual, something that had been attempted dozens of times over the centuries with no success. This time, however, they were casting a wider net. Every female wolf in the palace and surrounding territories would be required to stand before the sleeping king and speak or sing, based on the ancient prophecy that claimed only one specific voice could break the curse. Maya felt her throat tighten with anxiety. She had spent her entire life trying to remain invisible, and now she would be forced to stand before the most powerful wolves in the kingdom and expose herself to their scrutiny and inevitable mockery. What they did not know, what no one could ever know, was that Maya had been hearing a voice in her dreams since she was 7 years old. It had started as a whisper, so faint she thought she imagined it, a deep masculine tone that seemed to come from very far away, as though calling through layers of water or mist. Over the years, the voice had become clearer, more distinct, though she never understood the words it spoke. Sometimes it sounded desperate, other times soothing, as though trying to comfort her through her own nightmares and difficult days. She had learned not to speak of it after her mother had taken her to a healer who declared her touched by moon madness and prescribed herbs that made her sleep without dreaming. Maya had pretended the herbs worked while secretly disposing of them, unwilling to lose the one constant companion of her lonely existence. The ritual was set for the full moon, 3 days away, and the palace erupted into controlled chaos as preparations began. Maya watched from the shadows as noble families arrived with their eligible daughters dressed in their finest gowns, each one believing she might be the prophesied voice that would wake the king and secure her place in history. The Omegas and lower-ranked wolves were an afterthought, included only because the council wanted to be thorough, but no one truly believed someone of low birth could hold such power. Maya used her invisibility to her advantage, observing the political maneuvering and whispered conversations that revealed far more than the speakers realized. She learned that not everyone wanted the king to wake. Counselor Darius, who had held the position of regent for the past 50 years since the previous regent's death, seemed particularly agitated by the ritual. His son Marcus had been positioned as heir apparent, despite having no blood claim to the throne, and the awakening of Theron would demolish decades of careful political construction. Maya filed this information away with the instinct of someone who had survived by paying attention to the currents of power flowing around her, even when those currents could crush her without notice. The night before the ritual, Maya's dreams were more vivid than ever before. She stood in a vast darkness, but instead of feeling afraid, she felt drawn forward by invisible threads of connection. The voice that had accompanied her for so long was clearer now, and for the first time, she could almost make out words. It spoke her name, or something that sounded like her name, with a desperate urgency that made her chest ache. She reached out into the darkness and felt warmth, solid and real, as though she had touched skin rather than shadow. The voice wrapped around her like an embrace, and she felt tears streaming down her face, though she did not know why she was crying. When she woke, her pillow was damp, and her heart was racing with an anticipation she could not name. If you are enjoying this story, please consider leaving a like and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring you more content like this, and we love hearing from you about which moments resonate most deeply. The ritual chamber had been prepared with meticulous care. Hundreds of candles cast dancing shadows across walls carved with ancient runes that most modern wolves could no longer read. The air was thick with incense meant to honor the old gods and invite their favor. King Theron had been moved to a chair positioned at the head of the room, his body arranged to maintain dignity despite his unconscious state. Maya thought he looked unbearably lonely, sitting there in his finery, surrounded by people who wanted to use him for their own purposes, rather than genuinely hoping for his return. The ritual began at moonrise, with the highest-ranked females approaching first. Daughters of council members, ladies of noble houses, each one stepped forward with confidence and sang or spoke whatever words they believed might break the curse. Some chose love songs, others recited poetry or prayers, and a few simply commanded him to wake with the authority of their rank. Nothing happened. Hours passed, and the crowd grew restless as wolf after wolf failed to produce even the slightest reaction from the sleeping king. Maya noticed Counselor Darius beginning to relax, his shoulders losing their tension, as it became clear that none of the noble ladies would succeed. When they finally reached the lower ranks, exhaustion had set in, and most of the nobility had stopped paying attention, conversing quietly among themselves, as though the Omegas attempting the ritual were merely fulfilling a tiresome formality. Maya felt her stomach churning with nerves as her turn approached. She had no idea what she would say or do, had not prepared anything because she had never believed it would matter. The Omega before her finished speaking to no response, and stepped aside with relief, clearly written across her face, happy to return to obscurity. Maya forced her feet to move forward, even though every instinct screamed at her to run. She climbed the 3 steps to the dais and found herself standing directly in front of the sleeping king for the first time. Up close, he was breathtakingly beautiful in a way that made her chest constrict painfully. His features were aristocratic and strong, his lips full and perfectly shaped, his dark lashes resting against high cheekbones. But it was not his physical beauty that struck her motionless. It was the overwhelming sense of recognition that crashed through her like a physical force. She knew this face. She had seen it 1,000 times in dreams she had not quite remembered upon waking. This was the presence she had felt in the darkness, the warmth she had reached for, the voice that had kept her company through years of loneliness. Without conscious thought, Maya began to hum. It was not a song she had learned, or a melody she had practiced. It simply flowed from her as naturally as breathing, a tune that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul, from a place she had not known existed. The humming shifted into wordless singing, her voice rising and falling in patterns that felt both ancient and intimately familiar. She was not aware of the chamber falling silent around her, of every head turning in her direction, of Counselor Darius standing abruptly with alarm flooding his features. She only knew that she was singing to the man in front of her, and that somehow, impossibly, he was listening. She watched as color began to return to his face, as his fingers twitched against the arms of the chair, as his chest began to rise and fall with deeper, more substantial breaths. His eyelids fluttered, and Maya's voice caught in her throat as his eyes opened for the first time in 3 centuries. They were silver, bright as moonlight on water, and they focused on her face with an intensity that should have been frightening, but instead felt like coming home. Theron's lips parted, and he spoke a single word, his voice rough from centuries of disuse, but still carrying the unmistakable power of an alpha king. He said her name. Not Omega, not girl, but Maya, as though he had known her all his life, as though he had been waiting specifically for her. The chamber erupted in chaos. Voices rose in shock and confusion, demanding to know how a lowly Omega could possibly be the one. questioning whether this was some trick or deception. Through it all, Theron's eyes never left Maya's face, and she found she could not look away from him either, caught in a connection she did not understand, but could not deny. The king rose from his chair with a grace that belied his long sleep. He was tall, powerfully built, and radiated an authority that made even the boldest council members step back instinctively. He reached out and took Maya's hand, his touch sending electricity racing up her arm and straight to her heart. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger, clearer, though still rough around the edges. He told the assembled crowd that this woman, this Omega they had overlooked and dismissed, had been his anchor through centuries of darkness. Her voice had reached him when no other could, had kept his mind from fracturing under the weight of eternal dreaming, had given him hope that someday he would return to the waking world. Maya felt her knees weaken, and Theron steadied her with his free hand, his touch gentle despite his obvious strength. She wanted to explain that she had heard him too, that he had been her companion through lonely years, but words seemed inadequate for the enormity of what was passing between them. She could feel something clicking into place inside her chest, as though a piece of herself she had not known was missing had suddenly been restored. The look in Theron's eyes suggested he felt the same thing, a recognition that went deeper than logic or reason. Counselor Darius recovered from his shock quickly, his political instincts overriding his surprise. He stepped forward with a smile that did not reach his eyes and welcomed the king back to the waking world with elaborate phrases about joy and celebration. Maya noticed how his gaze kept flickering to her with barely concealed hostility, and she understood with chilling clarity that she had just become a problem that needed to be solved. If she was truly the one who had awakened the king, then she represented a threat to all the power structures that had been built in Theron's absence. The king seemed equally aware of the undercurrents in the room. He kept Maya close to his side as he addressed the council, his tone pleasant, but carrying an edge of steel that suggested he was not a man who could be easily manipulated. He declared that he would need time to understand what had become of his kingdom during his long sleep, and that Maya would remain under his personal protection as the one who had freed him from his curse. The way he phrased it made it clear this was not a request, but a command, and no one in the room was foolish enough to challenge. An alpha king, who had just awakened from a 300-year curse. We hope you are as captivated by this story as we are. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next chapter of this incredible journey. Hit that notification bell to stay updated. The following days were a whirlwind that left Maya feeling constantly off balance. She had been moved from her tiny room in the servants' quarters to a suite in the royal wing that was larger than any space she had ever inhabited. Attendants who had previously ignored her now bowed and addressed her with respect. They clearly did not feel. Their eyes filled with confusion and resentment. She was given fine clothes and jewelry, though she felt like a child playing dress-up, certain that everyone could see she did not belong in such finery. Theron insisted on her presence at every meal and every meeting, much to the dismay of his council. Maya quickly realized that the king was using these gatherings to assess who could be trusted and who had been complicit in the corruption that had taken root during his absence. He asked pointed questions about policies and decisions, his silver eyes sharp as he catalogued every nervous glance and hasty explanation. Maya found herself watching the same dynamics, her years of survival by observation, making her sensitive to the subtle power plays and unspoken alliances forming and reforming around them. In private moments, which were rare and precious, Theron would sit with Maya, and they would talk about the dreams they had shared. He described endless darkness punctuated by her voice, how he had clung to the sound of her like a lifeline when madness threatened to claim him. She told him about growing up hearing whispers she could not explain, about feeling less alone because of a presence she could not see or touch. They discovered that their dreams had sometimes overlapped, that moments she remembered as particularly vivid corresponded to times when he had fought hardest against the curse, as though their desperation had strengthened the connection between them. The bond between them was undeniable, but also terrifying in its intensity. Maya had never been in a romantic relationship, had never even been kissed, and suddenly she was bound to the most powerful man in the kingdom through a connection that defied explanation. Theron was patient with her uncertainty, never pushing for more than she was ready to give, but she could see the hunger in his eyes when he looked at her, the barely restrained need to claim what his instincts told him was his. She felt the same pull, a desire that shocked her with its strength, but fear held her back. She was not ready to lose herself completely in something she still did not fully understand. The investigation into the curse revealed layers of conspiracy that shocked even Theron's dark expectations. The witch who had cursed him had not acted alone, but had been hired by a faction within his own council, who wanted him removed without the political complications of outright assassination. The curse was meant to keep him sleeping indefinitely, creating a power vacuum that certain families could exploit. What they had not anticipated was that the curse would bind his life force to the kingdom itself, so that his sleep caused a slow, magical decay that was draining the land of vitality. Maya discovered her own role in this larger story when ancient records were unearthed from the royal archives. Her maternal line descended from the Moonsingers, a nearly extinct group of wolves who had possessed the ability to walk between the physical world and the realm of dreams. This rare magic, dormant in her bloodline for generations, had awakened in her as a child in response to Theron's desperate psychic calls for help. Their connection through dreams was not random chance, but the result of her unconscious magic, reaching across the barriers between worlds to answer the cries of a king trapped in eternal sleep. This revelation changed everything. Maya was not just an Omega who happened to wake the king. She was the last known Moonsinger, bearer of a magical legacy that made her both incredibly valuable and incredibly vulnerable. The same people who had cursed Theron would not hesitate to eliminate her if they believed she posed a threat to their plans. Theron became even more protective, assigning his most trusted guards to watch over her, but Maya chafed at the restrictions even as she understood their necessity. The situation came to a head when an assassination attempt was made against Maya in the palace gardens. She had stepped outside for air, tired of being confined to her rooms, and 3 masked attackers had descended on her with silver blades meant to ensure she could not heal from her wounds. She would have died if not for Theron, who had followed her outside with the paranoid vigilance of someone who trusted no one. He had shifted into his wolf form, a massive creature with midnight black fur and those same silver eyes, and torn through her attackers with brutal efficiency. Maya had watched him kill to protect her, had seen the savage joy in his wolf's eyes as he defended what was his, and instead of being horrified, she had felt something inside her shift and settle. This was who he truly was beneath the political maneuvering and careful words. He was a predator, a killer when necessary, and he would burn the world down before he let anyone harm her. The realization should have terrified her, but instead, it made her feel safer than she had ever felt in her life. In the aftermath, covered in blood that was not his own, Theron had pulled her into his arms and buried his face in her hair, his whole body shaking with the fear of what he had almost lost. Maya had held him back just as tightly, finally acknowledging to herself what she had been trying to deny. She loved him. She loved this complicated, dangerous ancient man who had been calling to her across centuries. She loved him with an intensity that eclipsed her fear and uncertainty, and she was tired of fighting against what every cell in her body was telling her was right. She had pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, seeing her own feelings reflected in silver depths, and she had kissed him for the first time. It was messy and desperate and perfect, tasting of salt from tears she had not realized she was crying. Theron had responded with a hunger that threatened to consume them both, his hands tangling in her hair as he deepened the kiss, claiming her mouth with the same certainty with which he would soon claim the rest of her. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Maya had whispered the words she knew he needed to hear. She told him she was his, completely and without reservation, and she watched his eyes flash with possession and triumph and overwhelming love. Let us know in the comments what you think will happen next. Do you believe Maya and Theron can overcome all the obstacles in their path? Share your predictions and theories with us. The mating ceremony was held under the full moon in the sacred grove, where alpha kings had been bonded to their mates for millennia. Maya wore a gown of silver silk that moved like water with every step, and flowers were woven into her hair by attendants who had finally begun to accept that she was not going anywhere. Theron stood waiting for her at the ancient stone altar, dressed in the formal regalia of his position, looking every inch the king he had been born to be. But when she reached him and took his hands, she saw not the mighty ruler, but the man who had been her companion through darkness, and she smiled with a joy that radiated from her very soul. The ceremony was conducted by the high priestess, one of the few people in the kingdom old enough to remember Theron before his curse. She bound their hands with silver cord and spoke the ancient words that would tie their lives together permanently. When it came time for the exchange of vows, Theron spoke first, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with perfect clarity. He swore to protect Maya with his life, to honor her as his equal and his queen, to build a kingdom worthy of her compassion and strength. He promised that her voice would be heard in every decision, that her wisdom would guide his rule, and that he would spend every day of his life proving himself worthy of the miracle that had brought her to him. Maya's vows were simpler, but no less powerful. She promised to stand beside him through whatever challenges came, to use her gifts to heal the damage that had been done to the kingdom during his absence, to be his partner in all things, and never just his possession. She swore that her voice, which had called him back from darkness, would continue to be a light guiding them both toward a better future. And she promised to love him with the same intensity and devotion she had felt even when he was only a whisper in her dreams, a love that transcended time and space, and the boundaries between worlds. The binding was sealed with a kiss that sent power rippling through the grove like a shockwave. Those sensitive to magic gasped as they felt the surge of energy that came from the union of Moonsinger and Alpha King, a combination of gifts that had not existed in the world for thousands of years. The land itself seemed to respond, as though recognizing that its true king had returned, and brought with him a queen who could heal the decay that had set in during his long sleep. Flowers that had not bloomed in decades suddenly burst into color, and the air filled with a sweetness that spoke of renewal and hope. The celebration lasted 3 days, but Maya and Theron disappeared after the first night, retreating to the royal chambers where they could finally be alone without guards or attendants or political considerations. Their coming together was both tender and fierce, a claiming and a surrender that bound them together in ways that went beyond even the magic of the mating ceremony. Maya discovered that Theron was a generous and attentive lover, that he found pleasure in her pleasure, and that his control only made his eventual loss of that control more intoxicating. She learned her own power in those hours, learned that she could reduce a king to helpless need with a touch or a whisper, and the knowledge was heady and thrilling. In the quiet moments between passion, they talked about the future they would build together. Theron shared his plans to root out the corruption that had taken hold during his absence, to restore justice and fairness to a system that had become twisted toward serving the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. Maya spoke about establishing schools and hospitals, about using her Moonsinger gifts to train others who might carry dormant magic in their bloodlines, about creating a kingdom where an Omega could rise to be queen not, despite her rank, but because rank itself would matter less than character and ability. They both knew the road ahead would not be easy. There were powerful families who would resist change, who would see their reforms as threats to privilege and position. Counselor Darius had disappeared after the assassination attempt failed, and intelligence suggested he was gathering support from neighboring territories, possibly planning a more direct challenge to Theron's rule. But facing these challenges together felt different than facing them alone. Maya had spent her life feeling powerless and invisible, but beside Theron she felt capable of anything, and Theron, who had endured centuries of darkness with only her voice to sustain him, knew that with her beside him he could overcome any obstacle. The first major test came when they convened the full council to announce sweeping reforms. Theron proposed dismantling the rigid hierarchy that kept Omegas and low-ranked wolves in permanent positions of servitude, arguing that a kingdom was only as strong as its weakest members. He suggested merit-based appointments to positions of power rather than hereditary assignments, and he declared that all wolves, regardless of rank or birth, would have access to education and legal protection. The council erupted in protest, with several members declaring such changes would destroy the social order and lead to chaos. Maya had remained silent throughout most of the meeting, observing and learning as Theron had taught her. But when one particularly vocal council member dismissed the concerns of lower-ranked wolves as irrelevant to governance, she found her voice. She spoke about her own experiences, about being invisible and voiceless, about watching injustices occur with no recourse, because her rank meant her testimony was worthless. She reminded them that she, an Omega they would have ignored and dismissed, had been the only one capable of breaking the curse that had held their king captive. She asked them pointedly what other gifts and talents they had overlooked by judging wolves solely on their birth rank. Her words created a ripple effect. Other lower-ranked wolves, emboldened by their queen speaking so openly, began to share their own stories. The council was forced to confront the reality that the comfortable system they defended had created deep resentment and suffering among the majority of the population. Theron used this moment to push his reforms through, framing them not as radical change, but as a return to the values of justice and fairness that had supposedly always defined their kingdom. He was skilled at political maneuvering, making his opponents feel like supporting him was the only honorable choice, and Maya watched with admiration as he wielded power with precision and intelligence. The reforms passed, though not without significant opposition. Several council members resigned in protest, which Theron accepted with barely concealed satisfaction, immediately appointing wolves of lower rank and greater integrity to fill the vacant positions. The transformation would not happen overnight, but the foundations were being laid for a fundamentally different kind of kingdom. Maya threw herself into the work with passionate dedication, discovering that she had a talent for organization and the ability to connect with people that made her invaluable in implementing the changes they had envisioned. Months passed in a blur of activity. Maya established the first school that accepted students regardless of rank, personally overseeing the curriculum and ensuring that practical skills were taught alongside academic subjects. She worked with healers to create clinics in every territory, places where anyone could receive treatment without worrying about payment or status. And she began training with the few remaining practitioners of old magic, learning to control and expand her moonsinger gifts so that she could use them to serve the kingdom, rather than just her own needs. Theron dealt with the political and military challenges that arose from their reforms. Several noble families attempted small rebellions that were put down swiftly and with enough force to discourage others from trying. Darius finally emerged from hiding with an army of mercenaries and dissatisfied nobles, forcing Theron to meet him on the battlefield. Maya had wanted to go with him, but he had refused, unwilling to risk her safety, even though she was fully capable of defending herself. They had argued about it, their first real fight, but eventually she had conceded, because she understood his need to protect her, even when it was not entirely rational. The battle was brutal, but decisive. Theron's forces, fighting for a king they believed in, and reforms that would benefit them directly, fought with a dedication that mercenaries motivated only by payment could not match. Darius was captured alive and brought back to the capital to face justice for his role in the original curse and the subsequent assassination attempts. His trial was public and transparent, a demonstration of the new legal system that applied the same standards to everyone regardless of rank or previous position. Maya had attended every day of the trial, sitting beside Theron as they listened to evidence being presented and witnesses testifying about decades of corruption and abuse of power. When it came time for sentencing, Theron had consulted with her privately about what justice should look like in this situation. Maya surprised him by arguing for mercy, not because Darius deserved it, but because she believed their new kingdom should be defined by rehabilitation, rather than pure punishment whenever possible. Theron had studied her face for a long moment before agreeing, and Darius was sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of eventual release if he showed genuine remorse and worked to make amends for his crimes. The decision was controversial, with many calling for execution, but it sent a powerful message about what kind of rulers Maya and Theron intended to be. They would be firm, but not cruel, committed to justice, but not vengeance, strong enough to defend their people, but wise enough to know that strength alone could not build a lasting peace. The kingdom began to settle into its new reality, and while resistance remained, it was increasingly marginalized as more and more wolves experienced the benefits of the changes being implemented. If this story has moved you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might enjoy it. Your engagement helps us create more content that explores the depths of love and transformation. A year after the awakening, Maya discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mixture of joy, fear, and overwhelming love for the child she carried. Theron's reaction was everything she could have hoped for and more. He had swept her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength and buried his face in her hair, whispering thank you over and over as though she had given him a gift beyond price. That night, he had held her close and talked about the future, about the child they would raise together, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, and what kind of kingdom they wanted to leave to the next generation. The pregnancy was not easy. Maya's moonsinger magic interacted with the pregnancy in unexpected ways, causing vivid dreams and occasional moments where she seemed to exist partially in multiple realms at once. Healers with experience in magical pregnancies were consulted, and they assured her that while unusual, everything was proceeding normally. The child she carried would likely inherit gifts from both parents, a combination that had not existed in the world for so long that no one could predict exactly what form those gifts would take. Theron became even more protective during her pregnancy, if such a thing was possible. He hovered constantly, driving Maya to distraction with his concern, and making her laugh with his obvious anxiety about whether he would be a good father. She reassured him endlessly, reminding him that the man who had maintained his sanity through 3 centuries of cursed sleep and then chosen mercy over vengeance for his enemies was more than capable of raising a child with love and wisdom. Their daughter was born during a lightning storm that lit up the sky with spectacular displays of power. She came into the world screaming with impressive volume, her eyes already the distinctive silver of her father's, her tiny fists waving as though ready to fight anyone who challenged her. Maya held her for the first time, and felt her heart expand with a love so vast it seemed impossible that one person could contain it. Theron touched his daughter's face with trembling fingers, tears streaming down his cheeks as he marveled at the tiny, perfect life they had created together. They named her Selene, after the ancient moon goddess, and she grew rapidly in the way of supernatural children. By her first birthday, she was walking and talking and demonstrating both her father's commanding presence and her mother's compassionate nature. She also showed signs of powerful magic, occasionally phasing partially out of the physical world when excited or upset, giving everyone around her minor heart attacks until Maya learned to anchor her with lullabies that soothed her gifts into quiescence. The kingdom flourished under their rule. The reforms took root and expanded, creating opportunities that had never existed before. Wolves of all ranks found they could rise or fall based on their own merits, rather than the circumstances of their birth. Art and culture bloomed as people who had been suppressed found the freedom to express themselves. Trade increased as neighboring kingdoms took note of the prosperity and stability that characterized the northern realms under Theron and Maya's leadership. There were still challenges, of course. Change created friction, and not everyone was happy with the new order. But the underlying strength of what they had built became more apparent with each passing year. The kingdom was no longer held together by fear and rigid hierarchy, but by shared values and mutual respect. People obeyed the law, not because they feared punishment, but because they believed in the justice of the system, and they followed their king and queen not out of obligation, but out of genuine loyalty and affection. On the 5th anniversary of Theron's awakening, they held a celebration in the same grove where they had been mated. The entire kingdom was invited, and thousands came to honor their rulers and commemorate the day everything had changed. Maya stood beside Theron, watching their daughter play with other children without regard for rank or status, exactly as they had envisioned. She thought about the terrified Omega she had been, invisible and voiceless, certain she would live and die in obscurity. That girl seemed like a stranger now, so distant from the confident woman she had become. Theron must have sensed her reflective mood because he pulled her close and asked what she was thinking. Maya smiled up at him and told him she was thinking about dreams, about how sometimes the things we dream about in darkness turn out to be more real than the world we wake to. She reminded him that he had dreamed of her voice for centuries before they met, and she had dreamed of his presence without knowing what it meant. Their bond had existed before they had names for it, before they understood what they were to each other, and that faith in something they could not see had ultimately saved them both. Theron kissed her forehead and agreed that sometimes the most important things in life require faith in what cannot yet be proven. He had maintained faith that he would someday wake, and she had maintained faith that the voice in her dreams meant something real. That mutual faith had brought them together and given them the strength to transform an entire kingdom. He told her he was grateful every day for the curse that had bound him, because without it, he might never have found her, and a life without her was no life at all. They stood together as the sun set and the moon rose, their daughter between them holding each of their hands, surrounded by people who loved and respected them. The ancient trees of the grove whispered in the wind, and Maya could have sworn she heard them singing a song of joy and completion. This was what happily ever after looked like, she realized. Not the absence of struggle or challenge, but the presence of love strong enough to weather any storm. Not perfection, but partnership. Not power over others, but power shared and used in service of something greater than themselves. Years continued to pass, and their legacy grew. Celine matured into a leader in her own right, balancing her father's strength with her mother's compassion, her magic powerful and controlled. More children came, each one unique and precious, each one contributing to the tapestry of their family and kingdom. Theron and Maya grew older together, their love deepening and evolving but never diminishing, always the foundation upon which everything else was built. Historians would later write about the reign of the last Alpha King and his Moonsinger Queen, analyzing their reforms and debating the factors that led to their success. But the people who lived through that transformation knew the truth was simpler and more profound than any academic analysis could capture. They had been led by two people who loved each other completely, who had found each other against impossible odds, and who had refused to accept that the world had to remain as it was, rather than becoming what it could be. The voice that had called through centuries of darkness had been answered, and in that answering, a kingdom had been reborn. And every night when Maya sang their children to sleep, she remembered the man who had heard her voice when no one else could, and she was grateful for every moment of the impossible, beautiful life they had built together. Some bonds transcend time and space, and the boundaries between dreaming and waking. Some loves are strong enough to break curses and transform worlds. And sometimes, the most powerful magic of all is simply believing that something better is possible and having the courage to fight for it alongside someone who believes the same. Before you go, please remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. We have many more tales of supernatural romance, redemption, and transformation coming your way. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we look forward to sharing more incredible stories with you soon. Until next time, may your own dreams guide you toward the love and purpose you are meant to find.